Welcome back to this segment of Datum Line. Our message today entitled Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, this being part 2 in our new series. In our previous message on the gold standard, we addressed 5 aspects of that myth. 1, that there are no less than 3 different categories of gold standard, there being a gold coin standard, the gold bullion standard, and the gold exchange standard. Second, each of these separate gold standards has many variations, thus creating an even wider variety of so-called standards, each of which is and was subject to change. Third, the public was led to believe, erroneously, that the gold standard meant that all notes and certificates could actually claim gold, dollar for dollar, at par, when in fact normal banking practices never allowed for 100% redemption. 4, thus we cannot possibly return to a gold standard that never existed, at least the one in the minds of the public. And 5, the United States and other countries were maneuvered carefully through a series of gold coin standards to one or more varieties of gold bullion standard, and then finally to a mysterious and complex gold exchange standard, in which gold is placed offshore, where it is unexchangeable at par, dollar for dollar, as a monetary reserve to redeem any of those credit devices created out of nothing by the banking system. Bankers thus created a massive slave state fueled by 100% credit, the first and only global plantation ever organized in human history. Now, it should be pointed out that each of these 3 basic gold standards that we've mentioned were accompanied by different levels of public access to gold. That is, their gold, or your gold. First, the gold coin standard, as was thought to exist in 1914 when the Federal Reserve opened for business. This was when the gold was in your pocket, or your grandpa's pocket, home, or in the local bank vault, ready to allegedly redeem his, grandpa's, gold certificate, United States note, Federal Reserve bank note, or possibly a national currency note, there being somewhere around 7,000 banks of issue back in those days. Second, a gold bullion standard, which evolved beginning in 1917. Its evolution commenced in 1917 with an amendment to the Federal Reserve Act, when gold, which was held at local banks, could no longer count as reserves for credit expansion. It seems as though the Federal Reserve must have been insinuating that your local bankers were cheats and that they couldn't be trusted. But maybe if they deposited the gold with a Federal Reserve Bank of their district, which is what happened, then the Federal Reserve could verify that the gold really did exist and that the local bank could therefore multiply deposits on that gold. I mean, heck, if you can't trust the Federal Reserve, who could you trust? Redemption was later made available to the club members. You remember the rule, it's their club and you ain't in it? That's the club I'm talking about. As in the United Kingdom after World War I, where there was a 400-ounce minimum on redemption. If you didn't have enough claim checks, enough IOUs to claim 400 ounces of gold, you couldn't get it. In today's dollars, that would amount to somewhere around $750,000. Okay? Third, the latest development was the gold exchange standard. This is where gold is 3 times removed from your grasp, being moved offshore, if you will, in the custody of the most trustworthy, worshipful masters at the International Monetary Fund. That's in order to ensure stability of international trade, you understand. So color that gold gone, erased from public memory. You see, when the small-time thief stole your gold back in the early days, he at least put it back into circulation, so the economy as a whole never lost that gold. When the bankers stole the gold, it was to be lost to the economic situation and circulation forever. Why? So as to make the public totally dependent upon the substitutes for gold and silver, that being intangible credit which the bankers create out of nothing in virtually unlimited quantities at no cost to themselves. Okay? Now, England was the first country back in 1821 to officially adopt a monometallic gold standard. Prior to that, it was gold and silver, bimetallic. And this served the bankers well by reducing the supply of money provided by more abundant silver. Prior to World War I, most of the industrialized countries were on a gold coin or gold bullion standard, which were all said to have collapsed during that conflict. Well, why was that? Because the demands of war outstrip immediate monetary reserves of gold when elected officials now turn to the bankers to beg for loans of readily available imaginary bank credit, especially to finance unpopular wars of conquest. You know, it was said about England that the sun never set on the British Empire. The sun never set on the British flag. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. You probably didn't think I was going to sing to you this morning, but I figured I owed that to David Icke and some of our other English cousins over there who are listeners. The alternative to borrowing credit at interest is to win public approval to pay for the war in lawful money and without the interest burden. If the military campaign is just and necessary, then a free people will shoulder that burden. Slaves, on the other hand, will do as they're told. Politicians eager to build global empires on behalf of their corporate cronies avoid public resistance by floating interest-bearing bonds. Why not make war profitable, after all? And then by cranking up the fiat money presses so as to confiscate the needed armaments, manpower, and supplies. A government dependent upon gold and silver coin, produced by independent and free citizens, however, is less likely to engage in empire building for the likes of an East India Company, as did Great Britain centuries ago, or on behalf of Citibank, General Electric, Halliburton, Exxon Mobil, and other globetrotters of the CFR, Trilateral Commission, Club of Rome, Bilderberg, and APAC-related groups. As World War II drew to a close, the godmen of banking called upon the expertise of economists, like Professor Edwin Kemmerer. You remember, the Walker Professor of International Finance at Princeton University back in the 1930s. They asked him, among others, to devise and justify a gold exchange standard to facilitate the emerging interdependent global economy that would be regulated by the United Nations, which they created in 1945. To soften public resistance to a global government, the Allied forces arrayed against the Japanese, German, and Italian Axis powers were designated as UN forces years earlier, before the United Nations was even foisted upon the American people at the 1945 San Francisco Conference. Good salesmanship is essential to any transformation of the religious, political, and economic landscape, since people are naturally resistant to enforced changes in their habits, circumstances, and lifestyles. The next phase of global economic transformation was discussed in Professor Edwin Kemmerer's later book. I had the first one, 1935, called Money. I think that was his first one. But he later wrote a book called Gold and the Gold Standard, published in 1944. On page 209, Professor Kemmerer begins Chapter 8, entitled The Monetary Standard of the Future. Oh, boy. And this is where he asked, quote, with what sort of a gold standard should the world begin its post-war monetary economy? You see, they're already planning on how things are going to turn out after the war is over. Of course, this was not a rhetorical question, since he was prepared to supply the answer. In point number 3 of his 6 preliminary recommendations, which appeared on page 210, Professor Kemmerer says, quote, everything possible should be done by the government to inspire confidence in the currency, end quote. Now, he meant confidence in fiat money, or credit, if you will, which is the lifeblood of all socialist global tyranny. Confidence in gold coins doesn't require nearly as much government assistance. On page 211, the professor reminded his readers that, quote, there are 3 important types of gold standard: the gold coin standard, the gold bullion standard, and the gold exchange standard. Here's our music. This is our next break. I'm Bruce G. McCarthy, and you are listening to Datum Line. Welcome back to this segment of Datum Line. On the other side of the break, we're talking about Professor Edwin Kemmerer and his book, written in 1944, called Gold and the Gold Standard, where he said, quote, these various types, there were 3 types of gold standard, you remember, the gold coin, gold bullion, and gold exchange standard. He says, these types frequently overlap, and each of them is found in many varieties, end quote. He then cited a few advantages and disadvantages of each. Among the disadvantages of a gold coin standard, said Professor Kemmerer, are that it provides gold coin for internal circulation and makes it easily accessible to hoarders, making it the most expensive type in the amount of gold it requires. His choice of words seems to suggest a mindset that rejects you being free to save your own money for a rainy day by evoking a knee-jerk reaction to the H word, hoarding. Remember how hoarding surfaced in the encyclopedia as a cause for bank panics? Now, classical economists, I should say, used to praise gold as a good storehouse of value. In fact, they said it was the best storehouse of value. Savings were once encouraged as wise and prudent, but now it's called hoarding. You see, a world of instant gratification requires that you borrow and spend, borrow and spend, borrow and spend to sustain a materialistic throwaway lifestyle of perpetual interest-bearing debt, which is an absurd and unsustainable lifestyle. But not to worry. The international carbon tax will punish your unsustainable habits and overconsumption. Professor Kemmerer didn't happen to mention the chief among hoarders, however, were the bankers who paid Grandpa interest on deposits to induce him to store his gold in their vaults and to their trustworthy care. Just 20 years after the Fed opened for business in 1914, they confiscated his gold in 1934, a fact which Professor Kemmerer seems to have forgotten only 10 years later when he wrote his new book in 1944. On page 213, he sides with the banking fraternity, saying, quote, with the gold standard, the management that will be required, see, we're going to have a managed currency, you see. It should be conducted, he says, according to certain established principles that will be accepted by the world's leading central banks, end quote. So you see, he had no qualms about central banks. He continued this theme on page 220, saying, the principal monetary authority in each country should be a central bank. On this subject, The recommendation of the Brussels International Conference of 1920 was sound in saying that in countries where there is no central bank of issue, one should be established. End quote. Said Kemmerer, the exclusive right, that's a monopoly, you understand, the exclusive right of note issue should be centralized in the bank. End quote. Karl Marx, Leon Trotsky, and Joseph Stalin could not have said it any better. And this from a man who some folks look to as an opponent of socialist Keynesian economics. If this be so, then it's another example of revolutionary Hegelian dialectics applied to political economy, where a deceived public is fed from another false paradigm. You know, at first blush, it might appear that America's so-called gold standard, which Black's Law Dictionary 5th edition says was extant between 1900 and 1933, was somehow unable to prevent the Great Depression of 1929 to 1938. But economic meltdowns, bank runs, and depressions are not caused by gold. And almost no one dares to suggest that they were ever caused by silver. Bank runs, or panics as they're called, are caused by something intimately connected with banking and bank credit. It's called bankers. For it was they who issued the solemn promises to pay gold that they did not have. It was their criminal act of overissuing IOUs that caused those bank runs, not gold and not silver. But we were taught in the Marxist 10th plank government school system to blame a precious metal. It's the official story, after all. Now, a similar argument recently surfaced and was refueled by Sandy Hook, which says that violent crime is caused by guns and can only be fixed by gradually confiscating all of your firearms. Likewise, in 1913, the bankers promised to solve our economic woes by creating a central bank, a bank which confiscated our gold, 1934, and then our silver in 1965. What's that saying? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. But many of us Americans are evidently too proud and arrogant to be ashamed of our manifold stupidity. Well, here's the music. This is our mid-time break. I'm Bruce G. McCarthy. You're listening to Datum Line. This message, Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, Part 2. Welcome back to this half of Datum Line. We're dealing with economic myths today. You know, history, facts, and common sense have been superseded in large part by myths argued from within the confines of a false paradigm where the menu of choice concerning information has been artificially limited, with the ensuing debates being rendered fruitless. It's in this predetermined arena that opposing factions apply the same imprecise vocabulary while ignoring essential considerations, where spokesmen both for and against the gold standard hold to the same myth that gold was used to back the money. Both sides then argue whether inflation can be effectively controlled by the mutually agreed nonsense of anchoring what they call paper money to gold. What they both call money is not and never was money. At best, prior to 1963, it was a promise to pay money. By law, gold, along with silver, were declared to be as money, and as such, they were backed by nothing. IOUs for money, be it gold or silver, were backed by gold or silver, which was the money. Notwithstanding the fact that all legal tender gold and silver certificates and notes, even if they had been 100% redeemable, circulated in violation of the United States Constitution, for those of you who profess an allegiance to that document. You know, there's a school of economic reform, distinctly populist, which is hostile to gold. One reason for this hostility is found in the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which populists and others have construed incorrectly for want of accurate definitions as applied to economics. In a nutshell, they believe that certain bankers own virtually all of the world's gold supply, and that it was they who foisted the gold standard upon us for the purpose of ensuring our economic enslavement. Now, on this latter point, they are correct, but with respect to owning all of the gold in those central bank vaults, they err. Unless, of course, the international bankers acquired that gold by lawful means, in which case it would lawfully be theirs, wouldn't it? If, however, that gold was obtained unlawfully, then Congress needs to commence foreclosure proceedings against the Federal Reserve System to recover the gold and return it, along with our monetary silver, to general circulation. Unfortunately, Congress benefits from their conspiratorial partnership with the Federal Reserve and therefore has no vested interest in solving our dilemma, which is one reason to reject the idea that they can cure the problem by nationalizing the Fed, whereby Congress would become the absolute master of all industry and commerce, to quote President James Garfield. Which brings me to a major flaw in the populist platform, that being that the sins of banking are only found in private ownership of a central bank, not private ownership of banks in general, and that a privately owned central bank charges interest on principal created out of nothing. Replace the word private with the word government, and all of our miseries mysteriously are said to come to an end. In fact, populists tout this as the only constitutional solution, which simply is not true. But now, speaking of truth, let's go to the book called The Truth in Money Book by Theodore R. Thorin, a mechanical and aeronautical engineer, and Richard F. Warner, also a mechanical engineer, my copy being from 1989, and it's identified as the updated third edition. These authors are thoroughly antagonistic to gold, their position being summarized in Appendix number 11, entitled Monetary Science. Well, they're engineers after all, so they like the idea of science, and the gold standard. So monetary science and the gold standard, we're going to start at page 261, and we've got 8 pages. I won't read every word, but they have 8 pages where they pit their prowess against gold, or a gold standard, whichever it may be. So let's start on page 261, where they have the title. And the title seems to suggest that their position is scientific, and that gold somehow resides somewhere outside this realm of reasonableness, which we generally ascribe to science. They say, quote, "A vault filled with gold bricks seems solid and secure, but the question which must be faced is, will gold stop inflation? The answer is no." Now, on this point, Mr. Thorin and Mr. Warner are correct, but they argue from within a false paradigm where monetary gold is stored in a bank vault, while only God and the bankers know how many IOUs for that gold actually circulate in the economy. The more bogus IOUs to compete with that gold and for your wealth in the economy, the more inflation, which the authors seem to acknowledge. Next sentence. Gold convertibility can never halt the inexorable increase in unpayable debt produced by fractional reserve deposit expansion banking. Now, they use a rather complex term there, fractional reserve deposit expansion banking. They could say it a little simpler, I think. It's just the fact that banks create funny money out of nothing. Okay. Now, they're correct here as well. But this is not a flaw inherent to gold, but rather the crime of creating and lending deposits of money, which should have been gold and silver, that did not exist. Now, to this problem, the authors respond, saying, "This is the flaw which must be removed from the monetary system in order to make the dollar inflation-proof and stabilize the economy." Well, having swallowed much leaven of the economic Pharisees, the authors begin to slide down the slippery slope of confusion by assuming we even had or have a monetary system, which we do not. As the Federal Reserve Bank of New York pointed out in 1977, quote, "The Federal Reserve System works only with credit." Page 12, keeping our money healthy. What was the money? Credit. And credit is not a synonym for money. Furthermore, dollars, which are simply units of measure, were never subject to inflation, any more than ounces, gallons, or cubic yards could be subject to inflation. On page 262, they say, quote, "First of all, the question needs to be asked, where is the United States going to get the gold needed to back the dollar under a gold standard?" Before answering this question, we need to address another misconception about gold backing the dollar. Units of measure are not backed by anything. The gallon, for example, is not backed by water. The pound is not backed by beef or chicken. And cubic yards are not backed by concrete. Now, as to where the gold might come from, we can come up with probably 4 sources. First, the gold that was stolen by the banking system can be retrieved once we restore enough common sense to where justice prevails in our currently sin-laden country. But don't hold your breath on that one. Second, the United States is, or at least was, a major producer of gold. So we could mine it. Gee, I never thought of that. 3, we can sell our products on the world market in exchange for gold that is still being produced in other countries like Russia, India, and South Africa. 4, then there's the gold that's stored under the mattress all across America, waiting for the day when it will become worthwhile to start spending it. Under legal tender, so-called laws, it is not desirable or even sensible to try to pay a debt with gold, because a Federal Reserve note, which bears the number $1, is just as valuable to the bank or to government as a $1 gold coin. In fact, I remember probably 30 years ago acquiring my first $1 gold coins, and they cost between $120 and $240 back then. Now, why on earth would you spend $120 to $240 to get a $1 gold coin so that you could pay off a bank mortgage dollar for dollar, as if they were no more valuable than a $1 Federal Reserve note? What would you do under such a circumstance? You'd keep the gold under the mattress, and that's exactly where it is. Now, the authors go on to say, on the same page 262, quote, the nation's monetary crisis is a shortage of money. Well, they got that one right, because there isn't any money, nor do they wish to correct the problem by introducing anything as money to the economy with their proposed legislation. Now, if we go back to page 239 for a moment, to point number 14 out of their 18-point guideline principles, they say, quote, get a load of this now. A sovereign government exercising its monetary authority creates money and spends it into circulation simply by writing good checks against no funds to pay for authorized national expenditures. I couldn't believe anybody would write such a statement, let alone engineers. Now, why you and I couldn't do this, the authors somehow fail to explain. But I think you know why we couldn't do it. And I think you know why you'd go to prison if you were caught doing that on a regular basis. On page 263, they continue. It is impossible, they say, to solve this problem by further restricting the money supply by linking it to gold. Hold it just a moment. We're going to link the money to gold. But you see, it was the gold that was declared to be as money in the Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792 at Section 11. If gold was the money, how do you link money to gold? Well, they think that an IOU for money is money. Now, if you can't define your terms any better than that, then you need to go back to aeronautical engineering. Nevertheless, they say it is impossible to solve this problem by further restricting the money supply by linking it to gold, silver, wheat, or any other commodity, end quote. So once again, the authors of Monetary Reform cannot distinguish between monetary gold and silver as opposed to dishonored promises now to pay it. The authors then highlight something else. They say, quote, the inability of gold to maintain constant purchasing power. Okay, so now they're suggesting that gold is unstable. The inability of gold to maintain constant purchasing power in the face of the operation of fractional reserve deposit expansion. Well, hold on, let's just stop right there. As if this again was somehow a flaw inherent to gold. The flaw isn't in gold. The flaw is in credit creation. The credit creation is what creates the fluctuations in the present market. We've covered that in previous messages. So you see, it was not a flaw inherent to gold, but it was a flaw inherent to the crime of fraud and theft perpetrated by the creation of imaginary bank deposits, which compete with gold, and according to legal tender laws, those numbers are just as valuable as those numbers appearing on a gold coin. The authors then bask in the assumption that gold is somehow unstable and therefore unsuitable for use as money, since its price, measured in dollars per ounce, is said to rise and fall on a daily basis in the London Exchange. Now, this is another myth that we'll be addressing in this series, since it's impossible to price gold in dollars per ounce. Now, I don't know about you, but English was never this much fun when I was in school. And I was fortunate to escape the clutches of modern economics professors who were let loose on society to lobotomize whoever crossed their paths. But now turning to page 264 and 65, the authors ask this question: does the United States Treasury own any gold? They answer it by saying, all the gold in Fort Knox or any of the other depositories in the country has been mortgaged to the Federal Reserve banks, end quote. Well, they may be right about that. But pray tell, what did the Federal Reserve System lend to us collectively by way of Congress, state legislatures, and municipal offices, for which our gold was mortgaged? If you can identify the substance of what it was that they loaned that was measured in dollars, I'll give you 100 pounds of it absolutely free. Page 265, they have a subtitle, Gold and Fear. They say one of the most remarkable features of gold is its ability to evoke confidence in the minds of so many people, despite its obvious inability to forestall economic panics. Wait just a minute. In fact, they say further, gold has consistently failed to avert financial panics. Well, why is gold responsible for stopping panics? The same could be said about the Constitution or even the Bible, neither of which have averted financial panics. Did you know that? But that fact in no way invalidates the Constitution or the Bible, nor does it invalidate gold. Panics are caused by people who ignore the principles of Scripture and the Constitution, both of which honor gold and silver. See? The people ignore those principles by placing their faith in credit created out of nothing by the God-man of banking. So why should gold be responsible for averting a financial panic? Page 266, they say, when monetary collapse threatens, fear drives many to the false theory that money must be based on a material commodity. Do they mean it's based on it? I believe that money should be a material commodity, not based on. See, there's a difference there. They say the cause of the collapse of an all-debt money system, however, is so totally unrelated to gold as to render a metallic base for the dollar completely irrelevant to the problem. I agree. The cause of the collapse is totally unrelated to gold. So then why is it that they blame people who believe that gold was supposed to avert the panic when they say gold is totally unrelated to the cause of the collapse. I agree. They have another subtitle called Gold and Hoarders. There's that H word again. They say fear also drives many to hoard gold on the premise that when money, what is that money, fails, well, the money is credit, the hoarders will be able to barter for real wealth, food, water, fuel, and so forth. President Franklin D. Roosevelt should have laid that false hope to rest years ago when, on January 31st, 1934, he signed a bill into law which required all United States citizens to turn in their gold or go to jail. Well, there's our music. We'll come back to this point on the other side of this, our last break. Welcome back to this final segment of Datum Line. We're doing a critique on the book called The Truth in Money book. It's an old book from 1989, my third edition. It's revised. But the authors had said in their assault on gold that FDR had made gold illegal, requiring all citizens to turn in their gold and or else go to jail. So now, do the authors insinuate that gold is somehow flawed because Congress and the President waged war against it on behalf of central bankers who stole it from our grandparents? Why would they trust Congress and a modern president to write good checks against no funds, which the authors admit we must be compelled by law to accept in order to implement their monetary reform proposal? You see, when we turn back to page 237, point number 6 of their 18-point platform states, quote, money is sought after and made universally acceptable in exchange for goods and services through legal tender laws requiring its use for the payment of debts and taxes. Does that sound like a free society to you? Did anyone ever require or force you to use or accept gold or silver coins? Was Abraham forced to do so in Genesis chapter 23 when he purchased land to bury his wife Sarah with 400 shekels of silver? Is a free market built on a foundation of legalized theft by government and where you are legally compelled to participate in being robbed? These authors seem to believe so. And their legislative proposal is a mirror image of the criminal confidence game we have now. The simplest monetary system employs gold and silver in coin form of a known weight and purity in harmony with the biblical law of just weights and measures, using a unit of measure, such as the ounce and fractions thereof, well understood by the people. If their understanding is clear, then a clever cadre of organized thieves will be prevented, or at least impeded, from teaming up with politicians to steal your money. When credit is suggested as a substitute for gold or silver, you can be sure that a plan is underway to steal your money. If you're in doubt about this, where did this sense of doubt originate? It sure wasn't the Bible, or even the Constitution. You can probably trace it to academia, media, and Hollywood. I'm reminded of an old Western movie in which John Wayne played the star part, and he was offered either gold or paper. And what did he say? I'll take mine in currency, if you don't mind. Oh, wow. Boy, you don't want to stick John Wayne with a gold coin. Oh, heavens, no. You see, we're taught to laugh at gold because it's quaint, cumbersome, barbaric, inconvenient, and unscientific in a high-tech world of credit. This appeals to a secular humanist mindset, but no one is dumb enough to suggest that manufacturers stop shipping bulky items like lumber, appliances, cars, furniture, RVs, or prefab swimming pools. If you expect the producer to ship you any of these items, why is it so unthinkable that you should pay them for it with pieces of gold or silver? Well, here's our music. This ends another installment of Datum Line. I'm Bruce G. McCarthy, your host, and I hope that this message has been of interest to you. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.